This week we'll be focusing on Chapter 7. It's entitled Attitudes, Behavior, and Rationalizations, and it's about the reciprocal relationship between our attitudes and our behavior and how they affect each other. Oftentimes people assume that people's behavior is driven by their attitudes or beliefs, but we're going to learn that oftentimes it happens in the opposite direction. Sometimes people change their attitudes based on their own behavior that it runs contrary to what their attitudes originally were. So we're going to be focusing a lot on this model of cognitive dissonance, and we'll go into much detail later in the lecture, but just as an overview, cognitive dissonance is a psychological tension state that is caused when two thoughts or two cognitions are contradictory to each other. Or it can also happen when our behavior doesn't match our attitudes or beliefs. So this psychological tension state or cognitive dissonance can only be resolved by either rejecting one of the beliefs, if it's a conflict in cognitions, or changing the behavior so that it matches the attitude or cognition, or you can deny the evidence, just kind of deny the whole thing. That usually doesn't resolve the dissonance very well. Rationalization is another tool that's used to reduce cognitive dissonance, and sometimes we change our attitudes in order to match our behavior, and that happens a lot more often than you might think. So we're going to start out by looking a little bit closer at the attitude part. What are attitudes? And our book tells us there are three components of attitudes. An attitude is defined here as an evaluation of an object in a positive or a negative fashion that includes three components. Affect, which is your emotion, the emotion that's attached to it. Cognition, the thoughts and the beliefs that are attached. And behavior, your action tendencies. Now, in social psychology, how do we measure attitudes? How do you know what kind of attitudes people have? Well, you're all familiar with some of the research methods we use that we've talked about early in the semester. And in particular, the survey is a handy tool for measuring attitudes. There are two different ways to measure it. The first way is by using a Likert scale. So a Likert scale is a numerical scale. It's a continuum that measures between, a typical one is between 1 and 7, or sometimes it's between 1 and 10. You're asked to rate something, whether or not you strongly disagree would be, say, continuum, on the end of the continuum on the number 1, and on a 7-point scale, 7 would represent that you strongly agree with a statement to measure your attitude. So that's one way to do that. You've got these anchors along the way for each number, and there is one problem with Likert scales, and that is that sometimes people don't answer them as truthfully as maybe you would like them to. So sometimes people want to put their best foot forward. There are some ways that you can control for that in designing your survey, but in addition to that, we can use a method called measuring response latency, as well as just numerical values. So not just measuring the scores on the Likert scale, but measuring the amount of time it takes an individual to respond to the question. So the idea here is that the longer it takes, the longer the question is deliberated, the less likely it is to reflect the genuine attitude that's being measured. So the faster the responses, the more likelihood that the attitude is stronger. So this is a tool used especially in questions that are that most everybody would agree with. So you might agree with it simply because it's the social norm. it's what would be expected that you would agree with. But to really measure whether you really strongly agree with it, measuring the latency between reading the question and responding to it is a good measure. So this would be in response to questions like, how much do you value freedom? Well, who's going to say they don't value freedom? The person that has a shorter answer probably values it. The shorter answer in time, in latency, is probably going to have stronger attitudes about that. Another one, how important is the environment? Most everyone, maybe not everyone, but most everyone that took a survey would probably agree that it's very important. But if you look at how fast they respond to that, you'll get a better idea. If they have to deliberate a long time, it's less likely that they have that attitude. Another less direct way of measuring attitudes is to use an implicit attitude measure, or IAT. So this is an indirect measure of attitudes that does not involve self-report. So this type of measurement taps into attitudes that people are either unaware of or attitudes that they're unwilling to report. So people don't actually realize that their attitudes are being measured. We're going to be talking next about LaPierre's study back in the 1930s and how it relates to this. Research has shown, and this was one of the first ones that really showed this, that attitudes might be very poor predictors of behavior. It would be a much simpler world if all of us would behave in ways that reflected our attitudes. However, it doesn't seem to be the case. So in this study, what they did is they traveled across the United States with a Chinese couple. This was remember the context of this, it was in the 1930s. There was a lot of anti-Chinese attitudes at that time. And as they went across the country and stayed in various hotels, they were surprised to find that they were not denied service anywhere. There was no discrimination towards this Chinese couple at all, except in one hotel, 1 out of 250 that they visited. And so after they did that, then they decided, well, we're going to measure attitudes in a different way. We're going to actually write them letters and ask them in advance whether or not they would serve Chinese customers. And 90% of those same hotels that they visited said that they would not. So that tells us that their attitude of not wanting to serve Chinese patrons was not reflected in their behavior, because when the actual Chinese couple showed up previously, they did not discriminate against them at all and served them without any question. Now, this is a big question, I think, that the text proposes, and that is, can we get in better touch with our attitudes through introspection, by sitting and really reflecting on our attitudes and coming up with reasons why we have the attitudes that we have. So this is work done by Wilson. If you look at number 11 and 12 on your study guide, you'll see a question that relates to this. Wilson and colleagues, excuse me. And what they did is they did an experiment where they asked people to, first of all, rate their overall attitude about their relationship that they were in, how good a relationship it was. And for one group, that became just the control group. That's all they did. Another group, they asked them to rate their overall relationship, but then they also asked them to reflect and introspect about why, and to write out the reasons why they were invested in their relationship, why they loved this other person. And then they followed them over the course of 9 months. And the group that had done the introspection and really reflected on why they were involved with this person were actually much more, significantly more likely to have had that relationship dissolve, or to rate the relationship as not as good as they did in the first place. The reason, why would that be? The researchers interpreted this as, if you have time to sit down and write down your reasons, you might not actually be able to capture the real reasons that you're attracted or love someone, because a lot of times some of the motivations to be with somebody involve things that aren't really easily articulated. It can be a gut feeling. It can be kind of a chemical attraction. There might be something that you can't quite put your finger on. You can't list it because you can't express it. So then what happens is you end up thinking you're in the relationship for all of these other reasons that you've written down. Like they're attractive, oh, they're fun to be with, and all of these other things. But the things that you can't articulate that drew you to the person aren't on your list. And so you tend to put more weight on the things you were able to write down and forget about, or disregard those other things that really have motivated you towards that relationship. And it turns out that oftentimes those things that attract us to others that we can't articulate or put a finger on actually do carry or should carry a lot of weight. Through research, we have found that attitudes seem to be pretty poor predictors of behaviors, but behaviors seem to be better predictors of attitude. For instance, when people's behaviors run counter to their attitudes, oftentimes they change their attitudes in order to match the new behavior that they exhibited. And this leads us to cognitive dissonance theory. I explained that at the beginning of the lecture. So here it's defined as the theory that inconsistencies among a person's thoughts, sentiments, which are feelings, and actions or behavior cause an aversive emotional state or cognitive dissonance that leads then to efforts to restore consistency between the thoughts and behaviors, or the thoughts and feelings. So how do we reduce dissonance? That dissonance is an uncomfortable psychological tension that we want to get rid of, kind of like guilt. Like we want to be consistent with our thoughts. We want our behaviors to match our attitudes. We want our feelings and our behaviors and our attitudes all to be consistent. Let's take the example of smoking. So smoking may cause dissonance because it's bad for our health, and we want to stay healthy. Dissonance can be reduced by quitting smoking. We change the behavior in order to match our thought that it's unhealthy. It can also be reduced by adding thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to reduce the inconsistencies. For instance, many people might find it hard to quit smoking, and they can reduce the dissonance by adding a thought such as, well, my grandfather smoked for most of his life and he lived to be a ripe old age. So that adds a rationalization or a justification for going ahead and having some inconsistencies between your thoughts and feelings. You add a little bit more weight to your attitude if you have the evidence of your one grandfather. So because behaviors can't be taken back, cognitive dissonance often causes changes in our thoughts and our feelings, and then that leads to rationalizations. Next time we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance in another way, about going down two different paths, having to make a decision perhaps between two choices, maybe even two good choices.